Duke Barga Regus called his son into the office to inform him he was being sent to die. Thor Regus was 17 years old. He walked into that room expecting a lecture. He walked out of it as a dead man. The Duke did not stand when Thor entered. He did not offer him a seat either. He simply looked at the boy over the papers on his desk and said the Empire had chosen to send a hostage to the demon territory this year, and as the eldest son of a duke, that responsibility fell on the Regus household. Thor already understood what that meant. Everyone in the Empire understood. Hostages sent north into the Demon Lord's territory were never seen again. The Empire called it diplomacy. The nobles called it a sacrifice. Nobody bothered to lie about it in polite company anymore. Thor asked the only question a son could ask in that moment. He asked why him. The Duke did not even look up. He said, "Because it doesn't matter even if you die." Behind Thor, the butler laughed. Not loudly, just the small, dry laugh of a servant who has been waiting years to laugh at that boy. Beside him, the captain of the household guard folded his arms and smiled. Thor knew both of them. The butler had raised him in the corner of the same house that had rejected him. The captain had watched him train from age 6 and had called him worthless from age 7. Neither of them looked away when he turned around. The Duke started reading. He read from a list. He read Thor's failures in the tone of a man reading a shopping receipt. At age 6, no combat skill awakened. At age 10, no offensive magic detected. At age 12, second appraisal. Still nothing. Only an inherited production skill. Alchemy. A servant's skill. A merchant's skill. A skill for people who could not fight. At age 13, moved out of the main house to a civil office in the capital. Buried himself in paperwork and item repair. Refused to try again. The Duke stopped reading. He looked up. He said the Regus household had produced generals for 6 generations, that the empire was built on the sword arm of its dukes, and a son who could not lift a sword was worse than a stranger. Thor said his alchemy was not useless. He said he had been quietly repairing broken magic tools at the government office for the last 4 years. He said his workshop record was cleaner than any senior alchemists on the imperial rolls. He said if he was given 1 more year, he could open his own shop. The butler laughed again. The guard captain said the Empire did not need shops. Thor's hand closed around the small alchemy stone in his coat pocket. He had carried it since he was 10. It was the first stone he had ever refined. He did not know why he did what he did next. Maybe he had spent too many years holding his tongue. Maybe the word die from his father's mouth had loosened something old and rotten. He pulled the stone out and threw it. It hit the Duke square in the forehead and bounced onto the desk. The room went silent. The Duke did not shout. He rose from his chair, walked around the desk, took Thor by the collar of his shirt, and drove his fist into the boy's stomach. Thor folded. The air left his lungs so completely he could not even gasp. His knees hit the carpet. Somewhere above him, the Duke was speaking to the guards. He was telling them to take the trash out. 2 soldiers took Thor by the arms and lifted him off the floor. Then something Thor would remember for a very long time. The butler picked up a folded white handkerchief from a side table. He walked to the Duke, took the Duke's fist in both hands, and gently wiped the knuckles clean. As if the fist that had just struck a Duke's son was something precious that had been dirtied. The guard captain steadied the Duke's sleeve while the butler worked. Neither of them looked at the boy hanging between the soldiers. Neither of them saw a person there at all. Thor did not remember being carried down the stairs. He did not remember the crossing of the courtyard. He remembered the sound of the carriage door closing behind him and a chain going around his wrists. He remembered the smell of straw on the floor. He remembered a soldier telling him, almost kindly, not to move too much because the chain rubbed. Then the carriage started moving, and the imperial capital of Bulgaria slipped away behind him for the last time. The journey took 10 days. The soldiers did not speak to him. They fed him twice a day and refilled his water bottle at wells along the road. Thor tried to sleep as much as he could because sleeping was the only thing that did not hurt. On the 6th day, one of the younger soldiers slipped him a small, hard piece of bread out of pity. On the 7th day, the same soldier stopped looking at him. On the 9th day, none of them looked at him at all, and Thor understood why. They were already thinking of him the way people thought of a coffin they were carrying. It was easier not to see the body inside. On the 10th day, the carriage stopped at the edge of a forest. Thor knew that forest. Every child in the Empire knew that forest. It was the black band on the northern map. It was the line where human land ended and the demon lord's territory began. Beyond the tree line, no imperial law reached. Beyond the tree line was where hostages were left. The captain of the escort unlocked the chain from Thor's wrists, but not the chain around his neck. He walked Thor to the edge of the trees like a man walking a dog. Then he pointed, with the same casual gesture the Duke had used, at a shape moving out of the shadow of the forest. Thor looked. 8 of them stepped out of the trees. Minotaurs, tall as houses. Horns wider than a man was long. Their armor was black and clean, and did not creak when they walked. In the middle of them walked one small figure, a girl with long silver hair, pointed ears, and a maid's apron folded over a black dress. She could not have been much older than Thor. She was smiling, not a diplomat's smile, a real smile. The kind of smile a person gives to a guest who has arrived on time. She stopped in the neutral ground between the two parties. She bowed exactly the way a maid welcomes a lord into a house. She said, in perfect imperial common, "Welcome, honored guest. My name is Mabel Refrain. On behalf of the demon lord, allow me to escort you home." Behind Thor, the imperial escort broke into a run. Not a march, a run. The captain of the escort did not even take his chain back. He simply dropped the lead in the grass and sprinted for the carriage. Within a minute, the carriage was gone. Thor stood on the edge of the trees with a chain still hanging from his neck, alone in front of 8 minotaurs and a smiling maid. Mabel walked up to him. Without asking, she reached up and unclasped the chain. She let it fall in the grass. She said, "You must be tired." Thor could not answer. He had used up every word he had in the Duke's office 10 days ago. Mabel took his hand. Her fingers were very cold. He noticed that first, before anything else. A small, unnatural cold, like her hand had never quite warmed all the way through. She led him past the row of minotaurs. One of them lowered its head. Thor's knees almost gave out from the noise it made. The minotaur was not attacking. It was bowing. Deeply. To him, he did not understand. The carriage waiting for them on the other side of the trees was not a carriage. It was a black lacquered coach with silver fittings, drawn by 2 horned horses whose manes ran like slow smoke in the still air. Inside, the seats were red velvet. There was a plate of warm food on a small tray. There was tea in a real porcelain cup. The tea was still steaming. Mabel sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap. She said, "Please eat. It is a 2-day ride to the castle." Thor stared at the tray. Mabel added more softly, "You are not a hostage here. Please believe me, you are a guest of the demon lord." He picked up the cup. His hands were shaking so hard the tea slopped onto his sleeve. Mabel pretended not to see. Outside the window, the black forest rolled past. Somewhere behind that forest was the country that had thrown him away. Somewhere ahead of it was the country that had, apparently, expected him for tea. They traveled for 2 days. Mabel did most of the talking, and she did it gently, the way a nurse talks to a fevered child. She told him about the road. She told him about the small villages they passed. She told him the names of the 2 horses. She did not once ask him about the empire, or the duke, or the chain that had been around his neck. She let him be quiet. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, her necklace broke. She had been leaning forward to pour him more tea when the small silver chain around her throat snapped. A pendant fell into her lap. It was a plain thing, a piece of green glass in a silver setting, a keepsake, not treasure. Mabel picked it up quickly and closed her hand around it. Her face did not change, but her hand shook. Just once. "Just for a moment," Thor said. "May I see it?" She hesitated. Then she opened her fingers. He took the pendant. He turned it over in his palm. The clasp had rusted through. Cheap work. Whoever had made it had not been paid enough to care. Thor slid his hand into his coat pocket. His alchemy stone was gone. He had left that on the Duke's desk, but a piece of raw silver alloy was still there. He always carried a scrap of something, old habit. He held the broken necklace in one hand and the alloy scrap in the other. Quietly, without thinking, he called on his skill. It answered wrong. The skill did not feel the way it used to feel. It did not feel like drawing water from a familiar well. It felt like standing in the middle of a river. His head went bright for a heartbeat. A voice he did not recognize, not spoken, not remembered, simply present, said something inside him. 6 attributes complete. Alchemy has evolved. Creation alchemy, unlocked. Subskills unlocked. Material refining. Attribute addition, appraisal. The scrap of alloy in his palm liquefied without heat. It flowed like water up along the broken chain, filled the gap, replaced the rust, wrote a new clasp out of nothing, and cooled again into a chain finer and stronger than the one Mabel had been wearing. The green glass in the middle sat unmoved. The whole thing had taken less than 3 seconds. Thor stared at his own hand. Mabel stared at the necklace. He handed it back to her, because he did not know what else to do. She took it. She turned it over once. She looked at him. She said, very carefully, in the tone of a maid asking a lord if the bath temperature was to his liking, "May I ask, Thor-sama, what skill you just used?" Thor said, "Alchemy." She said, "No, that was not alchemy." He did not know what to say to that either. Mabel lifted the pendant and clasped it back around her neck. Her hand pressed against the green glass for a long moment. Then she looked out of the window at the dark forest sliding past and said, mostly to herself, "The Demon Lord is going to be very happy." The demon castle appeared at sunset. It rose out of a fold of hills like a dark ship out of the sea. Long walls, 4 towers, a spire in the middle wrapped in blue-black stone. Thor had grown up hearing that the demons lived in a pit of skulls. Instead, he was looking at something that reminded him uncomfortably of the Imperial Palace, only cleaner, better maintained. The banners on the walls were not the shredded rags his tutor had described. They were sharp and new. The carriage crossed a bridge, passed a gate, and rolled to a stop in an inner courtyard. Mabel got out first and offered him her hand. He took it. He was too tired to be proud. The hall she led him into was long and warm. Braziers stood on either side of a black carpet. At the far end of the carpet was a throne, not raised on a stage, only slightly, and not gilded. On the throne sat a small figure in a long hooded robe and a white featureless mask. The robe was thick enough that Thor could not read the shape underneath it. He could not tell if the person on the throne was a man or a woman, tall or short, old or young. Something magical was interfering with his eyes every time he tried to focus. Beside the throne stood a blue-haired man in the uniform of a chancellor. His hands were folded. His face was polite. He was staring at Mabel with an expression that Thor could not read. Mabel stopped a proper distance from the throne. She bowed. She said, "Demon Lord Sama, Chancellor, the guest from the Empire has arrived safely, and..." Her hand lifted to the pendant at her throat. "He has already given me a demonstration." The Chancellor's eyes moved to the pendant. His polite expression cracked. He took one step forward, then another, then walked all the way down the carpet to Mabel, took her pendant in his fingers, held it up to a brazier's light, held it closer to his own eyes, and made a small sound in his throat that might have been a laugh and might have been a cough. He said, "This is creation tier work." Mabel said quietly, "Yes." The Chancellor turned to look at Thor. He was smiling now. It was the smile of a man who has been given something enormous and has not yet decided whether to be delighted or terrified. The figure on the throne moved. The masked head tilted a degree to one side. A voice came out from under the hood, young, female, and clearer than Thor expected. She said, "Bring him closer." Mabel guided him forward until he was standing at the base of the small dais. He did not know whether to kneel. He had never been trained for a real audience. In the end, he did not kneel. He simply stood and waited. The Demon Lord looked at him for a long moment. He could not see her eyes. He could not see her face. He could only feel that she was looking. She said, "You are the hostage the Empire sent this year." He said, "Yes? You were told you would be killed here. Yes? Do you believe that is what is about to happen?" He thought about the pendant. He thought about the warm carriage. He thought about the Minotaur that had bowed to him at the edge of the forest. He thought about the 8 or 9 kindnesses that had been placed in front of him in the last 2 days, without a single one being asked for in return. He said, "No." The masked head tipped very slightly to the other side. She said, "Good, because I have work for you." She gestured with one gloved hand. The Chancellor stepped closer and began to speak on her behalf, in the practiced tone of a man who explained things for a living. "The Demon Lord's territory," he said, "had a great many races and a great many needs, but very few gifted alchemists. The previous Demon Lord, the current one's father, had spent decades collecting curiosities from the human lands, from ancient ruins, from the border markets, from every place he could reach. Most of what he had collected sat in a warehouse behind the castle, because no one currently living knew what any of it did. If Thor was willing, he would be given a room in the castle, a maid to look after him, and full access to that warehouse. In exchange, he would examine what he could, repair what he could, and if his skill turned out to be what the pendant suggested, build what he could. Thor asked what the alternative was. The Chancellor answered before the Demon Lord could. He said there was no alternative. He said the Demon Lord did not kill guests, and she was not about to start today. The masked figure on the throne made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Mabel bowed. She said, "I will look after him, Demon Lord Sama." The Demon Lord said, "I know you will." That was how, in the space of a single evening, Thor Regis went from a chained hostage on the edge of a black forest to a personal alchemist of the Demon Lord, with a warm room, a working bath, a full meal, and a warehouse waiting for him in the morning. He lay on the bed in his new room for a long time before he could sleep. Above him, the ceiling was carved with a pattern of stars. The pattern was not one he recognized from any imperial constellation chart. It was foreign in a very specific way, and yet Mabel had made his bed with the same neatness his mother's old maids used to. It was as if two worlds were being folded gently over him at the same time. Just before sleep took him, he thought about the alchemy stone he had left on the Duke's desk. He wondered if the Duke had thrown it in a bin yet. He wondered if the Duke had felt it hit his forehead. He wondered if the Duke, in his whole life, had ever taken a hit from anyone. He fell asleep smiling, and did not know why. The warehouse was bigger than the throne room. Mabel opened the doors for him the next morning with both hands, because they were heavy, and stepped back so he could go in first. It was not what he had expected. He had expected shelves, cases, neat rows. What he found was a mountain range. Junk on junk on junk. Ceramic pots stacked to the ceiling. Chests half buried under armor. Books piled on rolled carpets. Weapons whose grips had rusted into a single mass. Machines with dials in a language he did not know. Statues of gods no priest in the Empire had ever named. 100 years of a dead king's shopping habit. Mabel said, "The previous Demon Lord collected everything. He labeled nothing." "I am sorry." Thor said, "This is perfect." He meant it. He had been trained on paperwork and item repair since he was 15. He had seen half-broken magic tools every week for 4 years, but he had never in his life been given permission to touch a room like this. He picked his way to the nearest pile and reached out and used appraisal. The skill did not tell him what the object was. It told him what the object had been trying to be. That was different. Alchemy in his old life had let him read materials. Appraisal here read intent. The rusted lump he was holding was a small clockwork frog whose spring had rotted. Purpose: to hop 3 times when wound. Rarity: low. Service life: expired 40 years ago. Manufacturer: not from this world. Thor's hand went still. Not from this world. He picked up the next thing. Appraisal answered. Not from this world. The next. Not from this world. A tin box with a picture of a laughing child on the lid. Not from this world. A silver key ring. Not from this world. A folded paper flower. Not from this world. Half of the warehouse had been imported from somewhere that was not the Imperial continent, and not the Demon Lands, and not any place a Dulgarian map had ever drawn a line around. He kept going. He climbed a small hill of rugs. On the other side of the hill, sitting on top of an unlocked chest, was a book. The book was thick, the size of a schoolboy's atlas, bound in green cloth. There was no title on the spine. There was a picture on the cover of a man in a blue apron holding a broom, smiling straight at him. Thor had never seen a smile that flat and confident on a servant in the Empire. He opened the book. The first page had a single line of text in a script he could not read. He tried anyway. Appraisal answered. The script resolved in his head as if it had always been in his own language. It said, in cheerful printed letters, "Welcome. Please choose your item. Delivery within 3 business days." Thor turned the page. There was a picture of a wooden tub. Beside it, 3 lines of text and a small number in a box. The text said, "Foot bath. Comfortable. Warm. Helps circulation. Please add water." The number said, 3,980. He turned the page. A picture of a cabinet. The cabinet was small on the outside. Inside, the picture cut away to show more shelves than would fit inside the outer shape. A note beside the picture read, "Simple warehouse. Dimensional expansion type. Please store dry goods only." Another page. A pendant on a thin cord. Health promotion pendant. Improves the flow of vital energy through the 5 elements. Recommended for the elderly. Another. A thin black tube with a red dot at one end. Laser pointer. For lectures. Do not shine into eyes. Another. A folded piece of cloth. Magic cloth. Repels stains. Breathes. Another. A cushion. Trap cushion. Traps whoever sits on it. Prank use only. Another. A parasol. UV cut parasol. Blocks 99% of harmful sun rays. Page after page after page. Household items. Small tools. Personal devices. Written in a language Thor could not read, but appraisal could. Priced in a currency Thor did not know but that no one in this world used. Sold, according to the front page, by 3-day delivery in a country Thor had never heard of. He sat down on the chest. He put the book in his lap. He said, out loud, to nobody, "This is a mail-order catalog." Behind him, Mabel said, "A what?" "A mail-order catalog. You buy things out of a book. You send a letter. They send you the thing. The Empire has small ones for spices and cloth. Nothing like this. This one is..." He turned another page. A picture of a hairbrush. Auto-detangling. Please clean the bristles weekly. This one is from wherever the hero came from. The founding legend of the Dulgarian Empire said that 1,000 years ago, the first heroes had been summoned from another world to drive back the demons. Nobody in the Empire had ever seen an object of that world with their own hands. Thor was holding one. The previous demon lord had, at some point, come into possession of a catalog printed in the world the heroes had been dragged out of. Mabel said, "Can you read it?" Thor said, "Yes." "Can you make what is in it?" He looked at the picture of the footbath. It was a wooden tub. He had refined wood. He had shaped tubs before. He had absorbed dark magic on the road 2 days ago and unlocked, according to a voice in his head, something called Creation Alchemy. He turned the catalog toward the light. He read the small text beside the tub. He imagined, in his head, exactly what it would look like when it was made. He said, "I think I can make this one." Mabel said, "For me?" He looked up. Her hand was pressed to her pendant. Her fingers were still cold. He had noticed it in the carriage. He had noticed it when she had taken his hand at the edge of the forest. It was the small, unnatural cold of a body whose magic did not circulate. He had read about that at the government office. He had never treated it, because in the Empire nobody wasted alchemy on a servant girl. He closed the catalog. He said, "Yes, for you. Chalo continue kartahun." Part 2. 4,200 words. Sab callbacks track mehe. Making the footbath took him the rest of the morning and most of the afternoon. He asked Mabel for wood. She brought him a stack of it from the castle's woodshed. He asked for a bucket of clean water. She brought 2. He asked for a small brazier. She brought a big one. He asked her, halfway through the 3rd hour, if she wanted to sit down and rest, and she said no, and she did not move from her spot by the door for the rest of the day. He did not know she was afraid he would disappear if she looked away. He laid the wood on the warehouse floor and read the catalog page again. The picture showed a shallow tub, oval, with 2 curved handles on the sides and a smooth inner surface. The tub in the picture was empty. Under the picture was one line of text. "Please add water." There was no instruction on how to build it. That was the point of a catalog. You did not build the thing. You bought it. Thor did not know how to buy it. He knew how to build it. He put his hand on the pile of wood and reached for his skill the way he used to reach for old alchemy at the government office. The skill answered a completely different way. It did not ask what materials he had. It asked what he wanted to make. He held the picture in his head. Curved sides, oval floor, 2 handles, smooth inside. He held the intent alongside the picture. He wanted it warm. He wanted it comfortable. He wanted the water in it, when the water came, to move a person's blood the right way through their body. Something in the pile of wood answered him. The wood did not burn. It did not splinter. It softened. It flowed like slow honey along the floor and gathered itself into a shape the exact size of the picture in his head. The handles curved themselves out of the wood, as if a potter had reached in with invisible fingers. The inside sanded itself smooth. When the last piece of wood finished settling, an oval tub sat in front of him on the warehouse floor, warm to the touch, and Mabel was making a small choked sound by the door. Thor said, "Water, please?" She poured the 2 buckets in without a word. The water inside the tub did not sit still. A small warmth rose off it. Not hot, not steam, just the exact warmth of a bath a mother had drawn for a small child. Appraisal, when he used it on his own work, told him what he had made. Foot bath, rarity, 9 stars, service life, 100 years, function, warms feet. Improves circulation of magic through the body over repeated use. Manufacturer, Thor Regis. He stared at that last line for a long time. Manufacturer, Thor Regis. It was the first time in his life a piece of text had used his name without any of the words shame or waste or disappointment attached to it. He said, "Mabel, come sit." Mabel walked to the tub the way a woman in a temple walked to an altar. She sat down on the small stool he pushed toward her. She began to untie her boots and stopped when her hands started shaking. Thor knelt in front of her without asking and untied them for her. Her feet, when they came out of the boots, were the same small cold he had felt in her hand. Cold in a way feet should not be. Cold in the way of a body that had been fighting a slow illness all its life without ever giving it a name. He guided them into the water. She made a sound. It was not a scream. It was not a gasp. It was the sound a person makes when a part of their body wakes up that has been asleep for so long they had forgotten it was theirs. Her hands went to her mouth. Her eyes filled. She was already crying by the time she could form a word. She said, "It is warm." He said, "Yes." She said, "It is warm all the way up." He said, "Yes." She said, "My mother told me nothing would ever warm me all the way up." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He knelt on the stone next to the tub and watched a girl he had known for 3 days weep, and he understood without being told that at some point during those 3 days he had stopped being a hostage in his own head. He was not sure when, he was not sure how. After a long time, Mabel wiped her face with the back of her hand and asked if she could try something. She lifted one hand out of the water. She held it in front of her. She whispered a word. A small ball of wind curled around her palm. It was thin. It was clumsy. It was, by any objective measure, a spell a 5-year-old would have thrown better. It was also the first offensive magic she had ever cast in her life. She looked at Thor over the wind. Her mouth was open. Her eyes were huge. She said, "I could never do this before." Thor said, softly, "You could always do it. Your blood was too cold to carry the magic. That is all." Mabel closed her hand. The wind died. Then she leaned forward, out of the tub, water splashing over the sides, and put her arms around him. She pressed her face into the front of his shirt. She was still cold, but less than before. She smelled like the herbal tea she had poured for him in the carriage. She said, into the fabric of his coat, in a voice muffled by cloth and by whatever was still trying to come out of her, "You gave me new possibilities." Behind them, at the warehouse door, someone made a small dry cough. Thor turned his head. Chancellor Kelv was standing in the doorway. He was holding a stack of papers. He had, at some point in the last hour, walked over from the main castle in order to check on the guest. He had been standing there long enough to have seen the foot bath finish itself out of a pile of wood, long enough to have seen Mabel Refrain, half-elf maid, use offensive magic for the first time in 22 years of life, and long enough to have seen her hug the imperial hostage in the middle of it. He was very pale. He said, in a completely flat voice, "I need to sit down." He did not sit down. He walked, with the same flat voice, to the nearest solid pillar in the warehouse, and he brought his forehead against it, gently, twice. He said still to the pillar, "The demon lord will want to know." He walked out. By evening the whole castle knew. By the next morning 3 separate demon officers had asked, politely and with straight faces, whether Thor was accepting appointments for personal item repair. By the 3rd day Mabel could hold the wind for a full breath, and by the end of the week she could send a leaf across the room with it, and by the end of the 2nd week she had stopped wearing the extra shawl she had worn to work every single day of her life. Her fingers were still small. They were no longer cold. Word traveled outside the castle too. Not all of it good. In the imperial capital of Dulgaria, in the same office where Thor had been told to die, Duke Barga Regis was reading a report about a magic sword. The report was from the imperial workshop, and the report was short. Princess Liana Dulgaria, 3rd daughter of the emperor, had been sent on a monster-clearing exercise with a party of guards. In the course of that exercise, she had drawn the blade of Saint Phalira, a light attribute magic sword the imperial workshop had certified for combat use. On the third strike against a boar, the sword had shattered above the guard. Fragments of the blade had cut 2 of her escorts and 1 of her horses. The princess herself had been forced to defend herself with a spare short sword for the remainder of the fight. She had survived. She was very angry. Duke Regus put the report down. He said to the butler, "This sword, which workshop certified it?" The butler said, "Ours, my lord." The duke was silent for a long moment. He said, "Which alchemist signed the certification?" The butler said, "The senior workshop alchemist, my lord." The duke said, "Who repaired it before certification?" The butler did not answer immediately. The duke asked again, in the same voice he had used to tell his son it did not matter if he died. The butler said, "The senior workshop alchemist attempted the repair, my lord. He was, unable to complete it." In the past, such repairs were handled by the junior at the government office. Duke Regus said, "The junior at the government office is on his way to the demon territory." The butler said, "Yes, my lord." The duke said, "How did the certification get signed?" The butler swallowed. He said, "The senior alchemist finished as much of the repair as he could and signed the certification on the assumption that it would hold." There was a long silence in the office. The butler stood very still. The guard captain in the corner discovered that his boots were suddenly very interesting. The duke said, "Get out. All of you, get out." They got out. He sat behind the same desk his son had thrown an alchemy stone across 2 weeks earlier. He stared at the wall. On the corner of the desk, still there because nobody had dared to move it, was a small polished alchemy stone with a tiny nick on one side from where it had struck a man's forehead. The duke picked it up. He held it in his fist. He put it back down. He said nothing for a long time. 6 weeks passed. Thor learned the shape of his new life without meaning to. In the mornings he worked in the warehouse. In the afternoons, he worked in a workroom the chancellor had cleared for him behind the throne hall. In the evenings he ate with Mabel. On the second week the chancellor started joining them for dinner. On the third week General Reisenga started sending small polite notes asking if the alchemist would be willing to meet him. Thor asked Mabel who Reisenga was, and Mabel said, with the same face she used when a particularly stubborn stain had appeared on a tablecloth, "He is a very large man." Thor said, "How large?" Mabel said, 2.5 meters. Please do not offer him a chair. He breaks them." Thor decided that meeting could wait a little longer. He built other things while he waited. He built a set of small warming stones for the castle kitchens so that the cooks did not have to relight the ovens in the middle of the night. He built a lockbox for the chancellor's private papers that would not open for anyone except the chancellor. He built a set of quill pens whose ink never froze because Mabel had complained about her ink freezing in the North Tower. He built a small wooden bird for a scullery girl he passed in the corridor because she had been crying about a real bird she had loved that had died. Each of those items, when he ran appraisal on his own work, came back with ratings the workshop alchemists of the Empire would have wept to see. 9 stars, 10 stars, manufacturer, Thor Regus. None of it made him feel anything strange until the 6th week. On the 6th week, at the end of a normal afternoon, someone knocked on the door of his workroom. The knock was small the way Mabel's knock was small when she had brought him tea and did not want to interrupt his focus. He said, without looking up, "Come in." The person who came in was not Mabel. She was small. She was smaller than Mabel. She was wearing a hooded cloak, plain, dark, with the hood pulled all the way up. He could not see her face. He could not see her hair. He could feel, in the room around her, a magic he had never felt before. Not like the Imperial mages, not like anything in the warehouse. Dark magic. So thick in the air around her that his own new dark attribute channel started singing in his chest just from being near it. He put his tools down. The small person said, "May I sit?" He said, "Yes." She sat. She sat on the workroom stool the way a very small child sits on a very tall chair, feet not quite touching the ground. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked, or seemed to look, at the piece of raw silver he had been shaping on the workbench. She said, "The catalog. There is a cabinet in it. On the 14th page, small on the outside, larger on the inside. Do you remember?" He did remember. He remembered every page. He said, "Simple warehouse. Dimensional expansion type. Please store dry goods only." The small person under the hood laughed. It was a very quiet laugh. He had heard it before, once, in a throne hall, from under a mask. He said carefully, "Demon Lord Sama." she said. Please, not in this room. She did not take the hood down. She left it up. She said her real magic burned too visibly to walk the castle in her own face without a mask, and the mask, in her own private conversation, was not something she wanted to wear. The hood was a compromise between showing and hiding. He was not to describe her, later, to anyone, in any physical way. She was here on her own. Chancellor Kelv did not know she was here. She would very much like it to stay that way. He said, "Yes," she said. "Can you make the cabinet?" He said, "I do not know. I have not tried. Simple warehouse requires dimensional folding. That is not a normal alchemical operation." She said, "I have brought you some dark magic." He looked at her. She lifted one hand out of her cloak. It was a small hand, pale, ungloved. It was, he noticed distantly, the first piece of her body he had seen. She turned it palm up. Above the palm, the air itself darkened. Not smoke, not shadow. A concentrated, quiet, breathing knot of dark attribute magic power, more than he had ever seen collected in one place in his life, held above a very small hand as easily as another person might hold a candle. She said, "Please try." Thor said, "Yes." He fetched wood. He fetched iron. He fetched the small brass hinges he had been saving. He laid them on the floor in the pattern he had used for the foot bath. He knelt in front of the pattern. Behind him, the small figure in the hood held the knot of dark magic just above his shoulder, and he could feel her magic move through his hair like a slow river. He held the 14th page of the catalog in his head. He held the intent alongside the picture. Simple warehouse. Small on the outside. Larger on the inside. Please store dry goods only. He reached. The room folded. It was not the wood folding this time. It was the air. A small square of space in front of him, bent inward on itself, and did not come back. The wood, the iron, the hinges, and the small brass fittings all lifted off the floor in one motion and moved through the fold and reassembled on the other side of it as a small wooden cabinet, waist-high, with 2 doors and a brass handle. From the outside it was the size of a bedside table. Thor opened the doors. Inside, past the 2 doors, was a room the size of a warehouse. He could see shelves. He could see floor. He could see a distant back wall. The room was empty. The room was there. He put his hand into it. His hand kept going. His shoulder followed. He pulled his shoulder back out. The doors closed. The cabinet, from the outside, was still waist-high. It sat on his workroom floor as if it had always been there. Behind him, the small figure under the hood said, in a voice that had lost some of its careful stillness, "Oh," Thor said. "It works." She said, "Oh." He turned around. She was staring at the cabinet. She had lowered her hand. The knot of dark magic had thinned to a wisp. Her whole body was very still, the way a person's body goes still when a piece of news is landing that they had not been prepared to receive. She stepped forward. She stepped forward again. She reached out, very slowly, and opened the cabinet doors herself. She leaned her small hooded head inside. She looked left, she looked right, she looked at the ceiling of a room that was not supposed to be there. Then, in the way of a child who has been told a story is only a story and has just found the story sitting in a cabinet, she stepped in. The Simple Warehouse's auto collection activated. Thor did not know it would. He had not asked for that function. He had not built it deliberately. It was in the catalog text, at the very bottom of the 14th page. In the small print, Appraisal had translated for him as an afterthought. Rare item auto collection. Not yet shelved items will be automatically classified and placed on the correct shelf. 2 objects on the small figure's body registered, apparently, as not yet shelved. The cloak lifted off her shoulders. The mask under the hood, which he had not until that moment realized she was still wearing under the hood, lifted off her face. Both objects flew, gently, to a shelf on the left-hand wall inside the warehouse, where they arranged themselves neatly next to each other. The doors did not close. The small figure standing inside the warehouse turned around. Thor saw her face. She was 15, blonde. The blonde was very pale, almost silver at the tips. Her eyes were pale blue and very large. Her horns, small and neat and pearl-colored, curled back from her forehead just above her ears. She was wearing a dark blue dress under the cloak, the kind of dress a very well-bred girl in the imperial capital might have worn to a private lunch. Her mouth was a small round shape of shock. Thor did not move. The Demon Lord of the Northern Territory, world-class dark magic user, terror of the Empire, hereditary ruler of the demon nations, stood in a warehouse he had accidentally built 10 minutes ago, in her stockinged feet, staring at him with a face that had never, in her entire life as far as he could tell, been shown to a stranger. She said, in a very small voice, "Please close the doors." Thor said, "Yes." He closed the doors, gently, from the outside. The cabinet was, once again, a waist-high bedside cabinet in his workroom. He turned his back to the cabinet. He said, "I am not looking." Inside the cabinet, a small voice said, "Thank you." He heard, muffled, the sound of a cloak being retrieved from a shelf. He heard the sound of a mask being lifted. He heard a small pause, and then a very small, very tired laugh from inside the warehouse he had built. A laugh, he thought, of a person who had been afraid of a thing all her life and had just discovered that the thing was, in fact, only a cabinet. The doors opened, she came out. The hood was back up. The mask, he could feel, was back on. She was, once more, only a small figure in a cloak. She said, "Thor Regis." He said, "Yes, Demon Lord Sama." She said, "In this room, when we are alone, please call me Ruki." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I would like you to keep the cabinet." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I would like you to build a matching one in the corner of my private chambers that connects to this one so that we can share it and so that Mabel can have tea in it and so that the Chancellor cannot walk in on us." He said, "Yes." There was a very small silence. She said, "I am the Demon Lord of the Northern Territory. I have never asked anyone for a hiding place. I have asked for one now. Please do not misunderstand me." He said, "I do not misunderstand you." She said, "Good." She walked toward the door. At the door she paused. She turned back. Under the hood, invisible to him, she was doing something he could not see. He would find out, months later, from Mabel, what it was. She was smiling. She said, "Thor Regis, the Empire threw you away." He said, "Yes." She said, "Please stay with us instead." She left. He stood alone in his workroom for a long time. The simple warehouse cabinet sat on his floor. Inside it was a whole room. On one of its shelves, when he opened the doors again the next morning, was a single small pale blue ribbon, folded neatly, that had not been there the night before. Appraisal told him it was a piece of the Demon Lord's hair ribbon, left on purpose, as a marker of shared use. He did not tell anyone about the ribbon. He kept the doors closed for the rest of the week and only opened them once a day to leave, on the same shelf, a small object of his own. A newly polished quill. A small copper coin from the Empire. A carved wooden fish, no bigger than his thumbnail. Each morning, the object he had left the day before was gone, and a different object of hers was in its place. A tiny embroidered handkerchief. A single sugar cube in a paper twist. A folded paper crane. They did not speak in the workroom about it. They did not speak about it at meals. They did not speak about it in the throne hall. But somewhere in the middle of the 6th week of his exile, Thor Regis had, without ever quite naming it, begun to trade small kindnesses across a folded space with the 15-year-old ruler of the enemy nation, and neither of them had told a soul. In the imperial capital, 600 kilometers to the south, Duke Barga Regis was reading a second report. This one was not from the workshop. This one was from the palace. Princess Liana Dolgaria, third daughter of the emperor, had submitted a formal complaint to the imperial court concerning the failure of the blade of Saint Phaelira. She had named the certifying workshop. She had named the senior alchemist. She had named the household under whose seal that alchemist worked. The court, in its wisdom, had scheduled a public hearing. The hearing would take place in 3 weeks. The duke would be required to attend. The butler, standing at a very careful distance from the desk, said, "My lord, if it would help, there is still time to ask the government office about certain records that were kept there, under the previous junior." The duke said, "The previous junior is dead." The butler was silent. He was not sure whether the duke meant Thor was dead in the sense of gone to the north, or dead in the sense of a man's own son ceasing to exist in his mind. He did not ask. The duke said, "Get out." The butler got out. The duke sat behind his desk. He picked up the small polished alchemy stone with the nick on one side. He held it in his fist. He put it back down. He picked it up again. He did not put it down the second time. Chalo Part 3. Bunt 4,300 words. Sab callbacks track mehe. The meeting with General Raisinga happened on a Tuesday, and it happened because Raisinga stopped asking politely. The Chancellor came to the workroom in the middle of the morning with a look on his face that Thor had learned meant something logistical had gone wrong. Kelv did not sit down. He stood in the doorway with a small piece of paper folded between two fingers and said, "The general is here. He is in the courtyard. He arrived on a horse." "The horse is bleeding from the mouth." Thor said, "Why is the horse bleeding?" Kelv said, "Because the general rode it for 2 days without stopping." Thor put his tools down. He walked with Kelv through the corridors of the castle and down to the inner courtyard, and by the time he reached the courtyard, he could already hear the general. Not shouting, not roaring, simply speaking, in a voice designed for a battlefield, in the middle of an enclosed stone yard, in a tone that made every window on the ground floor rattle. Raisinga was, in fact, 2.5 meters tall. Thor had thought Mabel had been exaggerating. She had not. The general stood in the courtyard the way a lit brazier stands in a small room. His hair was red, not the copper red of the imperial northerners, not the auburn of the border tribes, actual red, the red of a coal in the moment before it becomes an ember. It rose off his head in a slow lift the way a flame lifts when the fire underneath it is being fed from below. He was wearing a leather breastplate that had, at some point, been fastened with metal buckles, but the metal buckles had partially melted into the leather and never been replaced. He was armed. Of course he was armed. He was carrying a two-handed war axe against his shoulder the way a farmer carries a scythe. Beside him, on a smaller horse, sat a figure in full armor. Full armor. Not battle armor. Not travel armor. The kind of armor a person put on for a duel and then took off in the evening. Head to toe. Helm closed. Gauntlets. Greaves. Not one scrap of skin visible anywhere. The armor was black. Around the edges of it the metal was faintly discolored, the way a kettle discolors after too many years above a flame. The figure did not dismount. Raisinga saw Thor come out of the corridor and turned. When he turned, the entire courtyard turned with him, because the men-at-arms in the corners of the yard shifted their weight, and the horses at the stable posts flinched, and even the pigeons on the roof took off. He looked at Thor. He looked at Thor for a long moment. Thor understood, in that moment, that the general had been told a story about a boy from the Empire who was fixing things in the castle, and the general was now looking at that boy and finding that boy to be shorter, thinner, and less impressive than the story had led him to expect. Raisinga said, "You are the alchemist." Thor said, "I am." Raisinga said, "You are the one who fixed the elf girl." Thor said, "I gave her a foot bath." Raisinga said, "The Chancellor writes to me every week. He tells me you have made a warehouse the size of a barn out of a piece of wood the size of a stool. He tells me the Demon Lord has taken tea inside it. He tells me you are quiet. He tells me you have not once since arriving asked to be sent home." Thor said, "I have no home to be sent to." Raisinga's eyes narrowed slightly. The flame above his head rose a finger's width. He said, "Good answer." Then, without warning, he lifted the war axe off his shoulder and swung it in a slow, deliberate arc across his own body, and set the head of it down on the cobblestones of the courtyard with a boom that Thor felt in his teeth. The cobblestones cracked. Not from anger, from weight. The general had simply put the axe down the way another man might put down a book. He said, "My daughter is in that armor." Thor looked at the figure on the smaller horse. He said, "Is she injured?" Raisinga said, "She has been injured every day of her life for the last 3 years. That is the injury. Get her out of the armor." Thor said, "I am not a healer." Raisinga said, "I know what you are. I know what a healer is. I have taken every healer in this territory to my daughter, 12 of them, 2 of them from the Empire, purchased at cost. None of them helped. The Chancellor tells me you build things that no one else can build, so build something that lets my daughter take off her helm." Thor did not answer immediately. He walked, slowly, past the general. He walked, slowly, up to the smaller horse. The figure in the armor did not move. He could see, now that he was close, that the helm had a narrow slit for the eyes. Behind the slit, 2 eyes were watching him. He could not see the color. He could see the shape. The eyes were young, Not a child, but not a woman yet either. 15, perhaps. The same age as Ruki. He said, "May I know your name?" There was a pause. Then a voice came from inside the helm. The voice was not distorted by the metal. It was a normal, quiet voice. The voice of a girl who had grown up being told to speak softly. She said, "Agnes Frazad." He said, "I am Thor. May I ask you a question?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How long have you been in the armor?" There was a longer pause. She said, 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Behind Thor, the general made a small, ugly sound in his throat. Not a sound Thor had expected from a 2.5-meter flame giant. A sound that did not fit that body at all. Thor understood without turning that the general had counted the same number, exactly, in his own head, every day of those 3 years and 4 months. Thor said, "May I know why?" Agnes said, "My blood is Ifrit blood. My magic is fire. 3 years ago, 4 months, 11 days, my magic awoke. I cannot control the flame that comes off my skin. It burns fabric, it burns wood, it burns other people. The armor is the only thing that does not burn," he said. "The armor is uncomfortable," she said. "Yes," he said. "You cannot bathe," she said. "I cannot bathe," he said. "You cannot sleep out of it," she said. "I sleep in it," he said. "You cannot touch your father." There was a very long pause. She said, "No." The flame above Risenga's head sank down until it was almost gone. Thor stood in the courtyard for a moment. He thought about Mabel's cold hand at the edge of the Black Forest. He thought about the words of the mail order catalog on the 23rd page. He thought about the difference between the Empire's 5-element magic and the territory's 6-attribute magic, and about the moment, 6 weeks ago, when a voice in his head had told him that his skill had absorbed dark magic and completed a set. He said, "General." Risenga said, "Yes." Thor said, "I will need 3 days. I will need your daughter here in the castle for those 3 days. I will need Mabel Refrain to attend on her. I will need the Chancellor to release the small brass fittings from the 3rd warehouse shelf. I will need dinner, twice, in the workroom instead of the hall. And at the end of the 3 days, if what I make does not work, I will not charge you for the materials." Risenga stared at him. He said, "Charge me for the materials." Thor said, "Very well. I will charge you for the materials. Please have someone unload your daughter's horse. She will be staying in the castle for 3 days." There was a small silence. Risenga said, "You are not afraid of me." Thor said, "Not today." Risenga looked at him for a long time. Then, very slowly, the flame giant of the Northern Army, general of the Demon Lord's forces, holder of the Ifrit blood, lowered his head in a small nod. Not a bow. Not a submission. A nod. He said, 3 days. He turned. He picked up his war axe from the cracked cobblestones. He walked out of the courtyard, past his own daughter on the smaller horse, and he did not look at her as he passed her, because if he had looked at her, he would not have been able to leave. Thor built the health promotion pendant in 2 days. He built it because on page 31 of the mail order catalog, there was a picture of a small silver pendant on a leather cord, and beside the picture, 3 lines of text. Health promotion pendant. Improves the flow of vital energy through the 5 elements. Recommended for the elderly. The catalog text said 5 elements, not 6, 5. Thor had read those words for the first time when he was still building things for cooks and scullery girls, and had assumed the catalog was using the local 6-attribute system with 1 attribute left out for simplicity. He was wrong. On the evening he decided to build the pendant, he sat down in his workroom with the catalog open in front of him, and used appraisal on the text itself, deeper than he had ever used it, and appraisal answered. "The hero's world," said appraisal, "used a 5-element system: wood, fire, earth, metal, water. These were not the same as the 6 attributes of this world. These were a separate, parallel magic system. The catalog items had been designed with that system in mind." Thor sat very still. He thought about the moment, on the road to the demon castle, when his alchemy had absorbed dark magic and completed the 6 attributes and become Creation Alchemy. He thought about the catalog in front of him. He set his hand on the page. He reached, deliberately, for the parts of the text that appraisal had been resolving into words in his head. Not the picture, not the item, the system underneath. Wood, fire, earth, metal, water. Something in his chest opened. Not painfully, not overwhelmingly, simply opened, the way a door opens onto a room that had been there all along. A voice, quiet, said something in his head. 5 attribute manipulation, unlocked. Wood, fire, earth, metal, water. He sat in his workroom for a long moment. He thought. He was, so far as he knew, the first person in the local world in 1,000 years to be able to use both the local 6 attribute system and the hero world 5 element system. Both of them, together, at the same time. He did not tell anyone. He built the pendant. It was small, silver, on a leather cord. The stone in the middle was a small, pale yellow disc, no bigger than a fingernail. The disc rotated, very slowly, when he set the pendant on the workbench, the way a compass needle turns. It was turning through the 5 elements: wood, into fire, into earth, into metal, into water, and back to wood. The pendant, when he ran appraisal on it, told him what it did. It read a wearer's magic power. If the magic power was in excess, if it was more than the wearer's body could safely hold, the pendant rotated the excess through the 5 elements and returned it to the body as physical strengthening. Reinforcement. Muscle. Bone. Speed. The stronger the wearer's magic, the stronger the reinforcement. The angrier the wearer, the stronger the magic. Rarity, said appraisal. 9 stars. Service life, 100 years. Manufacturer, Thor Regis. On the 3rd morning, he brought the pendant to Agnes's room. Mabel had prepared the room. Mabel had also, at Thor's quiet request, prepared something else. Folded on the bed, next to the pendant tray, was a maid's outfit, not a servant's uniform, a dress. Long, dark, with a white apron. Neat, plain, well-made. Beside it, on the same bed, folded with equal neatness, was a second maid's outfit. Identical, Mabel's own. Agnes stood in the middle of the room in her armor. She stood the way a person stands who has spent 3 years standing. Not quite upright, not quite at attention. The armor had been polished but not opened. The helm was still closed. Thor said, "Agnes?" She said, "Yes?" He said, "I have made a pendant. I am going to put it around your neck without opening your helm. When I do, you may feel warm. That is normal. After a few moments, when you feel ready, please try to open the helm." She said, "It will burn you." He said, "It will not." She said, "You do not know." He said, "I do know. That is why I made the pendant." She was silent for a long time. She said, "If it burns you, I will not forgive myself." He said, "It will not burn me. If it does, I will build something else." She lowered her head. Thor stepped forward. He lifted the pendant carefully in both hands. Agnes's armor, up close, was hot to the touch. Not scalding, warm. The way a stove that has been lit and then damped down is warm. He slipped the leather cord through the small vent at the base of her helm. He guided it around the back of her neck and out through the other side. He fastened the clasp above her breastplate. He stepped back. The pale yellow stone at the center of the pendant began to rotate faster, not visibly faster. He could feel it. The 5-element cycle in the stone was accelerating. Wood, fire, earth, metal, water. Wood, fire, earth, metal, water. Faster, faster. The pendant was reading her magic. The pendant was measuring her excess. There was a great deal of excess. The pendant was cycling it, converting it, feeding it back into her body as reinforcement. Somewhere inside the helm, Agnes said, in a very small voice. "It is warm." Thor said, "Yes." She said, "It is warm all the way through." He said, "Yes." She said, "Nothing has been warm since I was 12. Mabel, in the corner of the room, made a small sound. Agnes raised her gauntlets. Slowly, she set her fingers on the sides of her helm. She hesitated. She said, "I am afraid." Thor said, "Take your time." She said, "You should stand back." Thor did not stand back. Mabel did not stand back either. Mabel walked forward instead. Mabel walked forward until she was standing right in front of Agnes, close enough to be burned if anything went wrong, close enough that Agnes, through the slit in her helm, could see nothing but Mabel's face. Mabel said, "Do it." Agnes lifted the helm. Underneath the helm was a face nobody in the castle except her father had seen for 3 years and 4 months. It was a young face. It was a pretty face. It was slightly flushed from the enclosed air of the helm. Her hair was the same red as her father's, but longer and softer. and pinned up under the helm in a way she had clearly been doing herself, without a mirror, every morning for years. She had freckles across the bridge of her nose, small ones, almost invisible. She looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at her. Mabel said, "Hello, Agnes?" Agnes's face changed, not quickly, slowly. Her lower lip went first, then the corners of her eyes. Then her whole face folded in the way a face folds when a person has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. Agnes said, "I burned you. When we were 12, I burned your arm." Mabel said, "Yes." Agnes said, "I have wanted to say I was sorry every day since." Mabel said, "I know." Agnes said, "I could not come to your house. I could not send a letter. I could not touch anything without it catching fire. I have wanted to say I was sorry every day for 3 years and I could not." Mabel said, "I know, Agnes." Agnes said, "I am sorry." Mabel said, "You are forgiven." Then Mabel, half-elf maid, personal attendant to the alchemist of the demon lord, stepped forward and put her arms around a girl in full black armor and held her, and the girl in the armor cried into Mabel's shoulder without setting Mabel on fire, for the first time in 3 years and 4 months. Thor stepped back very quietly. He waited by the door. After a long time, Agnes lifted her head and looked, past Mabel, at the bed. She saw the 2 folded maid outfits. She saw the second one. She saw that it was her size. She looked at Mabel. Mabel said, "The alchemist made the pendant. I chose the dress. I hope you will forgive me for choosing." "I did not know your size. I guessed." Agnes said, "You guessed correctly." She said, "Can I really wear it?" Mabel said, "Yes." They dressed her, together, behind a small folding screen Thor had set up at the far side of the room, and when Agnes stepped out from behind the screen, she was not wearing the armor anymore. She was wearing the maid's dress. It fit her exactly. Her hair was down. She looked, Thor thought, distantly, like every young lady he had ever seen at court, except more tired, and more real, and more herself. She saw herself in the mirror on the wall. She began to cry again. Not from sadness this time, from something else. She stood in front of the mirror and cried, and Mabel stood behind her with her hands on Agnes's shoulders, and Thor stood by the door because he understood, now, that this room did not belong to him for the next few minutes. Later, when everyone had settled, when Mabel had brought tea, when Agnes had sat down in a chair for the first time in 3 years without armor underneath her, Thor said, quietly, "I should go and tell your father." Agnes said, "I will tell my father." Thor said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Yes." "Please stay. I will go and get him." She got up. She walked to the door in a maid's dress, unarmored, unhelmed, unafraid. She opened the door. She walked out into the corridor. She came back 3 minutes later with her father. General Raisenga stopped in the doorway of the room. He saw his daughter. He saw his daughter's face. He saw his daughter's hair. He saw his daughter's freckles. He saw his daughter in a plain black dress with a white apron. He saw his daughter alive and standing and unburning in the middle of a room in the demon castle. He took 1 step forward. Agnes said, "Father, please do not attack the alchemist," Raisenga said, in a voice that had lost every trace of the courtyard. "I was not going to," Agnes said. "Yes, you were." Raisenga was silent for a moment. He said, "I was." He looked at Thor. He looked at his daughter. He looked back at Thor. He was, Thor could see quite clearly, having a difficult time deciding what to do with his hands. Agnes walked across the room to her father. She stopped in front of him. She reached up. Her hand, which had not touched another person's skin in 3 years and 4 months, settled against her father's cheek. She did not burn him. Raisenga closed his eyes. He did not say anything. He did not need to. After a long time, Agnes lowered her hand. She turned around. She walked back across the room. She stopped in front of Thor. She looked up at him. The pendant sat at her throat, its stone still turning slowly. She said, "Alchemist." Thor said, "Yes." She said, "I would like to swear something, in the name of the primordial flame. May I?" Thor did not know in that moment that the primordial flame vow was the highest oath of the Ifrit blood, and that it could be sworn in 2 forms. One form was the oath of a vassal to a lord, absolute loyalty until death. The other form was the oath of a lover to a beloved, body and soul, in one hand, offered. Thor did not know that. Raisenga knew that. Mabel knew that. Thor said, "Yes." Agnes knelt. not the deep kneel of a soldier, the straight, quiet kneel of a young woman who has decided something. She took his hand in both of hers. Her hands were warm, not burning, warm. She said, "In the name of the primordial flame, I, Agnes Frazad, swear to Thor, my hand, my flame, and my life." The pendant at her throat, at those words, gave one bright pulse. Then the whole room was warm. Not from her, from the vow. The primordial flame, whatever it was, had heard. She lowered her head. Raysenga, in the doorway, made a small sound. Half laugh, half sigh. He looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at him. Neither of them said what the sound meant. Neither of them corrected Thor. 2 days later, the general knelt in the throne hall, in front of the masked demon lord, and swore the same vow in the vassal form. In the name of the primordial flame, his sword and his life and his territory to Rookie Evergard until his last breath. It was, according to Kelv, the second strongest vow ever recorded in demon territory history. Kelvi's forehead struck a pillar that afternoon. 600 kilometers to the south, Duke Barga Regis was standing in the imperial court, in a hall he had walked into 100 times as a duke. He was not entering as a duke. He was entering as the head of a household under formal review. The blade of Saint Phalira, or what remained of it, had been laid on a velvet cloth at the front of the court. The pieces of it were arranged in the shape the blade had once been. There were 17 pieces. The 17th was very small. Princess Liana Dolgaria sat on a dais on the right-hand side of the court. She was not smiling. The chief inquisitor of the court read the record aloud. The record was thorough. The record named every person involved in the manufacture, repair, certification, and delivery of the sword. It named the senior workshop alchemist. It named the workshop foreman. It named the junior alchemist who had, according to the workshop's own logs, been the one to actually perform the repairs in the year preceding the certification. It named that junior alchemist by his full name, Thor Regis. The chief inquisitor asked whether the junior alchemist was present at the hearing. Duke Barga Regis said, no. The chief inquisitor asked why. Duke Barga Regis said, he was sent north as an imperial hostage 6 weeks ago. The chief inquisitor said, under whose authority? Duke Barga Regis said, mine. The chief inquisitor was silent for a long moment. He turned a page. He read a second record. This record, the court records, listed every hostage sent to the Demon Lord's territory in the last 20 years. 12 of them. None of them had ever come back. The record did not say the hostages had died. The record simply stopped, in each case, at the date they crossed the northern forest. The chief inquisitor said, so the person who repaired this sword is now beyond the reach of this court. Duke Barga Regis said, yes. The chief inquisitor said, and the certification was signed by the senior alchemist of your household. Duke Barga Regis said, yes. The chief inquisitor said, under your seal. Duke Barga Regis said, yes. Princess Liana Dolgaria stood up. She walked, in the silence, to the velvet cloth. She lifted the 17th piece of the blade. The smallest one. She held it up. She said, in a voice that carried the whole hall, this piece cut my horse. Not me. The horse. The horse died on the road because your sword shattered in my hand. I have ridden that horse since I was 11. Duke Barga Regis said nothing. Princess Liana said, your family has produced generals for 6 generations. Your seal is on this sword. This sword failed me. I would like the court to note that failure. Publicly, and I would like the court to note, publicly, that the person who might have repaired it correctly was sent by you, personally, to die in the north. The court noted. The chief inquisitor read the sentence out. The Regis household would be demoted 1 rank, from duke to count, with immediate effect. The senior workshop alchemist would be imprisoned for a period of not less than 5 years. The butler of the Regis household, as the person responsible for delivering the certified weapon to the palace, would be imprisoned for a period of not less than 3 years. The emperor, in his mercy, would allow the household to retain its lands. The former duke stood in the middle of the hall. He did not look at Princess Liana. He did not look at the pieces of the sword. He was, though he did not know it, in exactly the same posture Thor had been in 6 weeks ago in his own office. Head slightly bowed, hands still. A man being told, in front of an audience of people who had known him all his life, that he was smaller than he had thought. The former duke left the court. In the pocket of his coat, wrapped in a cloth, was a small polished alchemy stone with a nick on one side. He was still carrying it. He did not know why. Challo Part 4. Tight Closer with Cliffhanger. Ep 500 words. Final total target range May. 6 weeks later, the news reached the northern castle. It reached through a merchant's letter, carried by a border courier, delivered to Chancellor Kelv on a wet afternoon. Kelva read it standing up. Yeah, he read it twice. Then he walked, without knocking, into the workroom where Thor was fitting a new hinge to the simple warehouse. He said, "The Empire has demoted your father." Thor did not look up from the hinge. He said, "I know." Kelv said, "How?" Thor said, "The pixies told me." Kelv looked out of the workroom window. On the sill, half hidden behind a potted plant, sat a very small creature with folded wings. The creature waved at him. Kelv closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them again. He said, "The pixies are talking to you now." Thor said, "One of them is. Her name is Renee. She wants me to save her friend." Kelve said, "Of course she does." He set the letter down on the workbench. He walked to the pillar in the corner of the workroom. He did not hit it. He rested his forehead against it, gently, and closed his eyes. He said, "There is more." Thor said, "There is always more." Kelv said, "A monster has appeared near the western mine. Something the border scouts have been calling Gargarasa. Too large to hunt alone. The Empire is proposing a joint subjugation. Princess Lyanna will be sent north with the Holy Sword. To save face after the sword scandal, apparently." Thor set the hinge down. He said, "She will come here." Kelv said, "She will come to the border." "Not here." Thor said, "She will come here eventually." Kelv said, "Yes." Thor was silent for a long moment. He said, "The Demon Lord will need to be there." Kelv said, "Yes." Thor said, "I will need to build something new." Kelv said, "I assumed." Thor picked up the mail order catalog. He turned to a page he had marked, weeks ago, with a small strip of blue ribbon. On the page was a picture of a thin black tube, with a red dot at one end. Beside it, 3 lines of text. Laser pointer. For lectures. Do not shine into eyes. He closed the catalog. He said, "Chancellor." Kelvi said, "Yes." Thor said, "Please tell the Demon Lord that in 3 weeks I would like to accompany the army to the border." Kelvi said, "She will not agree." Thor said, "She will agree if I ask." Kelv looked at him for a long moment. He said, "You have changed." Thor said, "I have not. The Empire has. They sent me here to die. They will send a princess north to kill a monster. Between those 2 things, something I built quietly became the thing that decides how the border ends. I would like to be there when it does." Kelv said, "The former Duke will hear about it. Whatever you do at the border, he will hear." Thor said, "Yes." Kelv said, "He will not know it is you." Thor said, "Not yet." He picked the hinge back up. He fitted it to the simple warehouse. It clicked into place. Somewhere in the castle, in a room he had never been in, a 15-year-old girl in a mask was reading the same letter Kelv had brought, and putting it down, and standing up, and reaching for the cloak that had been folded on the shelf inside a cabinet he had built for her. In 3 weeks she would remove the mask in front of Princess Lyanna Dolgaria and shout, in front of every Empire soldier on the field, that Thor was hers and she would not give him up. In 3 weeks Thor would set aside the name Regis for the first time in 17 years and put on his mother's name instead. In 3 weeks, 600 kilometers to the south, a man in a count's coat would take a small polished alchemy stone out of his pocket, hold it in his fist, and, for the first time since the day he had struck his own son in an office he still could not walk into without stopping at the door, wonder if he had made a mistake. But that was in 3 weeks. For now, Thor Regis fit a hinge to a cabinet in a warehouse in the north, and a pixie on his windowsill smiled at him, and a demon lord in a mask read a letter alone, and a former duke in the south held a stone in his fist, and none of them, yet, knew what any of the others were about to do. The catalog lay closed on the workbench. Page 34 had a small blue ribbon in it.